real pleasure to welcome you to this fringe meeting that we're hosting this evening with our friends from the Labour Campaign for Human Rights on housing as a human right, making it happen. And as some of you will know, there was a composite motion that was passed at Labour Party conference yesterday, committing the party to campaigning to make housing a legally enforceable human right, a really important step forward. We will be hearing shortly from Lucy Powell, our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. She's just en route to us, so Lucy will be then setting out some of the steps on how we take that forward. We're really pleased to be leading on this campaign together with our colleagues in the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. It is Labour Housing Group's 40th anniversary, so it's nice to mark that anniversary with, I think, a really important step forward in that battle for housing justice that we've been championing for many years. And we will be producing a pamphlet around the issue of housing as a human right, which will be coming forward later in this year. Without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Matthew Turner, who's the chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. And Matthew, I'd like to say a few words about the work of your campaign.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, John, and thank you to everyone at the Labour Housing Group for working with us on this important issue. As John says, I'm chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, and for the last 2 years, we've been running a campaign on economic, social and cultural rights. And the ask we have is a fairly narrow and straightforward one. We want Labour to commit to enshrining into domestic law all of the internationally recognised economic, social and cultural rights that we as people within this country and within a civilised society ought to have and be able to rely on. They've been recognised by this government and this country for many years through international treaties, the rights to food, housing, education, work, healthcare and social security. They're the sister and brother rights of the civil and political rights that were brought home through the Human Rights Act in 1997. In many ways in 21st century Britain, sadly, tragically, these rights are more relevant to people's day-to-day lives than some of the civil and political rights, like the rights to freedom of expression or a fair trial. Because after 10 years of austerity and now a pandemic, there are millions of people in this country living in insecurity, whether it's food insecurity, housing insecurity, lack of access to decent education or even healthcare, and certainly a lack of decent social security, as we've seen with this pernicious effort now to remove the £20 addition to universal credit. So these rights are really important. They've been recognised for a very long time, and they need to come home. And the way to do that is to introduce a Social Rights Act to sit alongside the Human Rights Act and make these rights enforceable in domestic law. And that's what we're calling for, and that's what we're campaigning on. We started by focusing on the right to food. And we did an event at conference 2 years ago on the right to food, and did another event this morning on the right to food. But also looking at the right to housing. And it really is fantastic for us to be able to work with you guys on this ask we have, which is for, along with the other rights, to have a right to housing enshrined in law. The conference motion passed today is fantastic. It's brilliant to have Lucy Powell when she arrives here speaking. I'm really interested to hear what she says, and we can hope that the next Labour manifesto will commit to a right to housing. Thank you to Labour Housing Group. We're delighted to be doing this with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to now turn to my colleague from the Labour Housing Group Executive, Councillor Amanda Pinnock, who's also a housing solicitor, is going to talk about some of the issues around equality and why housing as a human right is so important from that perspective. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So there are various maxims that should resonate with all of us, like home is where the heart is, a person's home is their castle, charity begins at home, and so on. Our basic survival needs are food, health and shelter. However, having a stable environment is becoming increasingly difficult for many because of this government's lack of touch with us. We know that there is a direct link between socio-economic factors, health inequalities, and poor housing, and how cycles of deprivation continue to wreak havoc in society today. And nothing has exacerbated this even more than COVID-19. Although the government has introduced some temporary measures to try and address the housing crisis at the beginning of the lockdown, for example, a ban on evictions between March 2020 to September 2020, a short period where bailiff warrants were stayed or stopped, and landlords having to give a longer period of time to evict tenants. We know a number of these measures have now come to an end. From the 1st of October, we're likely to go back to pre-COVID-19 situation where landlords can give the usual required notice. So tenants are going to find themselves in a lot of jeopardy. The National Residential Landlords Association found that 840,000 renters have built up rent arrears because of COVID, and that groups between the ages of 18 to 20 were twice more likely to fall into arrears because of insecure accommodation, insecure employment. As the furlough scheme comes to an end, as it will do at the end of this month, we'll see how that will cause a lot of difficulties, not just for this particular groups, but all groups in society. The Citizens Advice Bureau found that in January this year, 500,000 private sector renters were behind with their rent, with an average debt of £730 million. And that was in January. I dread to think what the situation is likely to be today. The charity Step Change reported a similar number of struggling tenants and found an estimated 150 renters were at risk of eviction. They found that £370 million of arrears have built up since COVID-19. And more recently, what we've seen up and down the country is landlords taking the law into their own hands and illegally evicting tenants because they don't want to go through the process of applying to court for an order to evict tenants. Because of the length of time it's taken landlords to go to court, to put in these applications, for notices to be given and notices to expire, as I've said, they've taken the law into their own hands and forced tenants under duress to leave their properties. Illegally evicting a tenant is a criminal offence which carries a custodial sentence, but very few landlords are prosecuted, and that's because the police and local authorities fail to act. I believe that urgent reform is needed to address this as soon as possible, because we know vulnerable people are being affected by the way these landlords are behaving. Because of austerity and other financial measures and difficulties that local authorities face, they do not have the resource to protect the most vulnerable citizens. Another area of concern is universal credit and the government's intention to scrap the £20 uplift, which will take place on the 6th of October. Many people warned that those people on universal credit have benefited from this extra payment, and when it comes to an end, there'll be more poverty and there'll be more health issues. We know there's people today who are having to make decisions between eating, feeding their families, and putting the heating on. And this £20 uplift, although it may not seem like a lot of money to some people, is a lot of money to them, because it may be the difference between doing that weekly shop that they need for their families to survive and to thrive. So it's important that we support people who are in this situation. And adding race inequalities and structural injustice to the mix, and what we see is a very bleak picture for people from the Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities. The government in their own disparity audit found that people from the Black and minority households are more likely to live in overcrowded housing, more likely to suffer fuel poverty, more likely to live in substandard accommodation than white households. There is an overrepresentation in the most deprived neighbourhoods, which is linked to poor housing conditions and lower economic status, which of course leads to a negative impact in respect of their health outcomes, resulting in lower life expectancy and higher morbidity rates. Institutional racism also plays its part, with local authorities as well as registered social providers, because we know some housing officers are willing to steer people from the black and minority groups towards particular areas or particular types of housing based on their own biases. In September this year, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that more than a quarter of people from the black and minority communities spend over a third of their income on housing compared to 1 in 10 of white workers. People from minority backgrounds in lower paid jobs are far more likely to face unaffordable housing costs than white workers in the same occupation. 1820 households affected by the benefit cap in England are from black and minority groups, even though these communities make up only 3 in 20 of the population. Immigration policies like the right to rent and other social welfare policies are amongst the drivers of inequality that disproportionately affects these minority groups. And all these factors have led to a serious lack of secure housing, lack of good quality housing, and lack of affordable housing. The government's immigration laws and policies have disproportionately impacted because they are designed to hinder, not designed to help. No recourse to public funds means there is limited support for those people with limited status for them to obtain access to social housing because the criteria is strict and draconian. The right to rent provisions under the Immigration Act encourages landlords to use racist criteria not to rent to certain communities because it puts the onus on landlords to check the immigration status of tenants and creates financial penalties and criminal sanctions on landlords who rent to the wrong person. And of course, this is going to lead to discrimination and also suspicion about anyone who doesn't have a British passport. In a High Court ruling in 2019, it was found that the right to rent policies actively discriminated and is incompatible with housing rights laws. Since that ruling, the Home Office has gone on to successfully appeal that decision, although it found that some landlords may discriminate on the grounds of race. The scheme is justified as a proportionate means to achieve its legitimate aims. So they accept that it's racist, they accept that it's discriminatory, but as far as the Home Office and the government are concerned, it's proportionate and means, and it achieves the legitimate aims. The government is fully aware of how vulnerable families are suffering and the difficulties that they are facing. In the coming weeks, we've heard about food shortages, which may take place, higher food bills, higher utility bills, higher rents, and couple that with the furlough scheme coming to an end, the £20 uplift coming to an end, the end for protection of tenants. Winter is certainly going to be bleak for many tenants today, and many, many families. Having a stable home is a basic necessity and a basic right. No one should be denied a secure place to dwell, irrespective of their socio-economic status, their race, their legal status, or disability. And those who are most vulnerable should be treated with respect and dignity. Therefore, I call on my Labour colleagues, I call on allies, and anyone else out there who is willing to support this, to continuously hold this government to account and raise these crucial issues, because the louder we shout about these injustices, the more the powers and influence out there cannot ignore what we're saying. We must continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I think it was a really powerful exposition of the issues around inequality, the failure of the government to address these matters, and again, the reasons why housing as a human right is such an important campaign and endeavour for us all to be embarked upon. I'm now going to turn to our next speaker, who's Alicia Kennedy, who's a Labour peer and also the Director of Generation Rent. And we're touching on the importance of this campaign affecting the private rented sector and private renters.
Hi, as John said, I'm Alicia Kennedy. I'm the Director of Generation Rent. And for those of you who don't know what Generation Rent is, you've obviously got a leaflet on your chair in traditional Labour Party fashion. But we're a campaign and advocacy organisation for private renters. We're the national voice of private renters. And our mission is to ensure that every home in the private rented sector is safe, secure and affordable. And with that, we work with 35,000 supporters and renters across the UK whose lived experience really does drive our own policy development and our campaigns. So please join with us. And I just want to congratulate the Labour Housing Group, the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, and I'm sure Lucy, for the motion that you successfully passed yesterday, because having housing as a human right, which I'm going to explain, as Amanda touched on, is so important for private renters in this country. It's absolutely vital to give them the safe, secure and affordable accommodation they need. So secure and decent housing should be a basic human right, but it is a right too many in the private rented sector are denied. This sector, over the last 20 years, has just exploded. It now provides homes for 1 in 5 of us, a fifth of all households. And it's no longer just the purview of students and young people. It provides homes for children, families, pensioners. 36% of private renters' homes contain children. And people aged 35 to 44 are around 4 times more likely to be renting now than they were 20 years ago. And on our predictions, and the predictions by many academics, we can expect the retired private rented population to at least triple in the next 20 years. But yet currently, and this is why it is so important that housing is a human right for private renters, private renting, those living in the private rented housing, is worse than owner occupation and social housing as regards 3 things: security, cost and quality. And we're going to deal with security first because, as Amanda said, it's a huge issue. Obviously, there's an energy crisis and the lights... I don't know if you want me to carry on or stop, but, you know... Lucy and I are not used to candlelight. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's quite lucky the lights came back on because I don't know my notes off by heart. Yeah. Would have been a bit of an issue there for everyone. So back to the first top priority, and as Amanda said, it's security. That is the top issue for the private rented sector. Private renters can face eviction without reason, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, and given just 8 weeks to pack up and move out. It's wrong, it's unfair, it's unjust, and it's got to change. And this week, Generation Rent's own research showed that there were over 40,000 households in England that have been threatened with homelessness by landlords who have given them no-fault eviction notices in the last 2 years. So, yes, the government have promised to help end unfair evictions, but we're still waiting for the legislation to come forward to deliver that pledge. And on quality, today, 1 in 8 private rented homes in England is unsafe to live in. And on cost, high rents and the lack of affordable state housing means that private renters struggle to pay their rent, to save, and are forced to live far away from their work, friends, and family. With 40% of private renters paying more than 40% of their income, so many pay through the nose for homes that are in a state of disrepair, and it's a disgrace. And post-pandemic, as Amanda said, private renter poverty is at an all-time high. This year, now, there are 2 million renters that are now in receipt of universal credit or housing benefit. That's a huge increase from where we are before the pandemic. That's why, as Amanda said, the cut to universal credit for renters is cruel and it's unjust, and they won't be able to pay their rent and feed their kids, and I know the Labour Party has been campaigning to stop it. So we believe at Generation Rent that no one should pay more than a third of their income on rent. And we have to have a benefit system that actually covers the amount of rent, the actual amount of rent that renters have to pay to keep people in their homes. We desperately need legislation to change the private rented sector. We desperately need legislation to make housing a human right. Too many private renters live in poverty and insecurity. The rules are completely stacked against them. They're isolated, they're powerless, and they're exploited by criminal landlords. And that's why Generation Rent is so pleased to be here tonight, because we passionately believe that the right to a home should be enshrined in domestic law. For us, it's not just about access to a home, and I'm sure it isn't for you guys either. It's about the right to a safe, secure and affordable home. And as I said, security of tenure is the top of our list. The right to have long-term stability, you can imagine, what does that mean to you? It means your children can grow up in a home that they feel secure in. It means that you can put roots into the community. It means you can make friends, you can generate memories. You know, it's such a fundamental human right that I cannot believe in this country you can just be given 8 weeks to pack up and leave without any reason whatsoever, and it's got to change. They also need the right to live in a safe home, not cold, not damp, not overcrowded. And today we have renters living in homes where they're afraid to ask for repairs because they're scared the landlord will evict them. It's a national disgrace. So renters in this country, in our opinion, have a long way to go before they get the conditions enjoyed by many of the European counterparts. And as I said, the government has promised legislation. We're still waiting for that legislation, but they have promised that they will bring forward the Renters Reform Bill that they promised back in December. We're waiting for a white paper that was due this autumn. It may slip to the new year, but I'm going to take the government on its word and know that this legislation is coming, and that's where Generation Rent's fight will be. It's where the Labour Party's fight will be in the Commons and in the Lords, and I hope that you will join with us, hence sign up to Generation Rent, because it's about time that we cannot squander the opportunity given to us, afforded by this legislation, to not make change in the private rented sector. Now is the time to make that legislation work for renters. And as I said, it'll be a battle and we'll need your help, but we have to end unfair evictions for good. We have to raise standards by making sure there's a national register of landlords, stop illegal evictions, as Amanda said, and the discrimination in renting that is the purview of many ethnic minority communities in this country. And for Generation Rent, of course it's a question of law. Legislation matters, but it's also a question of political will and politics. A home is not a vehicle for wealth accumulation. It's a public social good. It is not a commodity. It's not an object of speculation, and it's certainly not a pension pot. Landlords are providing homes for people, and they should be considered as such. That's why it's a human right. And we look forward to you as Generation Rent, to working with you to make housing a human right. I believe strongly that together we can stop a safe, secure, affordable home from becoming a luxury for the few and make it a right for the many. So thank you for everything that you've done for that.
Our third speaker should need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. We've been really lucky as Labour Housing Group to have a really good relationship with our front bench shadow team over the years and had some really excellent leads for housing for Labour. So I'm really pleased to say that tradition's continued with the appointment of Lucy Powell as the Shadow Housing Secretary earlier this year. Again, another great ally of LHG in the work that we're trying to do, and we've got a really strong partnership, I think, to try and take that forward together. So really looking forward to hearing Lucy take us through what you'll be doing on the front bench to ensure that we make housing a human right.
Thank you so much. I mean, first of all, can I thank John and Sheila and everyone at the Labour Housing Group. It's all right, could be anybody, don't worry. I think you've been really, really helpful to me in these first few weeks as I've been the Shadow Housing Secretary, for all your engagement, all your support, all your advice, and steering me in the right direction on a number of things. And thank you so much, Labour Housing Group, for the excellent motion that you passed that sort of formed the basis and the skeleton, really, of the main motion that went to conference floor and was passed unanimously yesterday. And at its core was the principle of housing as a human right, and which I obviously want to come on to. And just before I do, could I also thank Generation Rent and Alicia and her team. I've known Alicia for about 25 years or more maybe, and there is no more formidable campaigner and organiser than Alicia, and I think that gives me great hope that the voice of the renters, the voice of Generation Rent, which, as we know, is not just one generation but many, as Alicia was saying, will punch through. And it's so important because the growth in the private rented sector and coming alongside the same time as affordability and quality and security going down needs that formidable voice. And the alliance and the coalition you've put together, Alicia, is really fantastic. So hopefully we can work together on that in coming months. So Yeah, I just want to say a few things really by way of introduction. You're probably all sick to death of hearing me, but thank you. Well done for getting here. I'm sorry I was a bit late because I think I was doing prior to this was even further out of Brighton than this meeting. So my feet really hurt now and my hair's completely wrecked, but because I got caught in the rain. But anyway, well done for getting here. Those of you who heard me speak on the conference floor yesterday will have heard me talk about housing as a human right, and really the difference between the Labour vision of housing and homes and the Conservative vision and the kind of framework that we've actually had in this country, probably not just in the Conservatives but for quite some time, where the roots of the current housing crisis that we now face lies in that ideology that housing is a commodity, it is an item to be traded, it's an asset, it's a pension pot, it's part of an investment portfolio. It's not seen as that fundamental bedrock to a successful, stable, happy life that everybody deserves. And that's the vision that Labour has, that's the vision that we all share, that's what we all know housing to be, and that's what we need to inject back into this debate. And that's why the principle of housing as a human right is such a really good and profound and positive one to try and reshape that agenda and what that actually means. And it isn't just housing, as Alicia said, it's about stable, truly affordable, quality, decent home that people can live in and develop a life in for a long period of time and through different stages of their lives as well. And that's what we'll be developing. So I was just trying to think, well, what does housing as a human right really mean in kind of sort of tangible terms? And I've got a few ideas about that. It's got to mean, doesn't it, ending rough sleeping, ending homelessness. That's what housing as a human right has got to mean in one of its forms. And we saw that during the pandemic, when we set our minds to it and we have the political will, we have the resources, we have the partnerships, and there's a need, we can end rough sleeping as quickly as we want, let's be honest. And we've lost that now very, very quickly coming out of the pandemic. I mean, we lost it actually halfway through the pandemic, unfortunately. But everyone in is something that we could all be very proud of in this country, and it's something that Labour will be continuing to campaign on. So we've got to end rough sleeping, and there's lots of good initiatives about that. It also means about tenants' rights, as we've been hearing from Alicia. That's about ending no-fault evictions, which we are absolutely committed to, and not just Section 21, but ending all no-fault evictions and making sure that we don't just end up with different types of evictions sort of coming through the system. And I think it was, again, during the pandemic, we saw what we can do when we have a moratorium on evictions and what that means. And obviously all of us really worry about that now coming to an end, and we could already start to see that coming through the system. It's not just about ending evictions, though. It's about having real recourse, real accountability, real voice as a tenant. It's horrifying to hear that people who are paying really good money, a lot of money, most of their wages on their housing costs, are not able to ask for repairs or not able to make demands. And that happens in the private rented sector. It also happens, I'm sorry to say, still in the social sector as well. So we've already been tabling amendments to legislation coming in Parliament to give tenants that voice that they really should have. It means that homes should be safe. So the building safety crisis that we're now seeing is one example of the housing policy, that approach to housing, forgetting what housing is about. The building safety crisis that's now before us is a tragic symbol of that housing policy go wrong, when you don't have that understanding about what it is you're creating, which is homes, and you cut corners, and there's no oversight, there's no accountability, and then no one will step in afterwards and put it right for you either, which is what we're seeing in many tall buildings. Housing as a human right has to mean it's affordable. And affordable means it's linked to what you earn. It's not linked to the market rate. It's not linked to an inflated market. It's linked to what you earn. And so part of what we've been saying this week is that Labour's going to be working with organisations like Generation Rent, like the Labour Housing Group, Labour councils up and down the country to redefine what truly affordable means in our planning law. And that will be linked, it will be based on around 30% of average local incomes. We'll refine that and work with people about how to do that. But it has to mean affordable. And then we've got to work that out in the private sector as well, because that truly affordable measure, as you know, is a certain type of house. It has to mean quality. Housing as a human right has to mean quality as well. And we've seen on the ITV documentary when that goes horribly wrong, and we, as MPs, as politicians, we get stories every single day of terrible, terrible quality. And as we've heard, there really isn't the right approach about that. There should be in social and council housing. Unfortunately, there isn't as much as there should, but certainly not in the private rented sector. And that has to be, why aren't we leveraging more for how much we pay to private landlords through housing benefit and universal credit to lift up quality across the sector? We could be doing a lot more there, and there's loads of other policy approaches like landlord licensing, landlord registrations, putting those things around the system. But it's got to have enforcement as well at its heart to get that quality. It's also about sustainability and being warm and being able to afford the bills, not just the housing costs, but the other bills as well. So there's a huge programme of retrofit. Labour is going to be leading that agenda as well. On retrofit, and the government's as well as new green homes as well. And for me, it also, just finally, just want to say, it also means right to outside space, right to quality life, right to being near services and near education, and there are various ideas around that as well, because we're not just talking about houses here, we're talking about homes, but homes sit within communities and they sit within places, and we've got to think about how we create places fit for people to live in, and that's what housing as a human right means for me. So they were just some sort of ideas around that, John, to kickstart the conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lucy.